Okay, let the analysis begin. I'm going to start this week with the poetry unit talking about The Tyger by William Blake. In your textbook, it's on page 1068. If you look at The Tyger, it's not a misspelling, it's spelled with a Y. You can see the date next to William Blake's name and the date of the poem, which is 1794. So when I talk about old school poems, that's what I mean. I'm not going to give you a workshop for the poems these weeks, because once I give you one, you can't do it on that poem. And I have a feeling that I would like the poems that you guys might like, so I'm going to let you do the worksheets on your own. You won't have an example for me, but I will sort of walk you through what I might do on a worksheet for this poem. So you can, I guess you could steal my ideas and do one on this. So the Tyger, let's talk about that. First, how do we categorize this poem? If you read it, is it telling a story, or is it a narrative poem, or is it more of a lyric poem? Hopefully the idea of a narrative poem is not going to be foreign to you, because we've been talking a lot about narrative in our fiction unit, right? How it's basically it's telling a story or it has a plot. But this word lyric might be a little bit new to you, so if you check out your textbook, it defines lyric as, this is on page 2067 in the final book, the writing portion of the book. Lyric, a short poem expressing the thoughts and feelings of a single speaker, often written in the first person. Lyric poetry traditionally has a song-like immediacy and emotional force. So is there a story being told here, or is it more of a lyric? And I would tend to say that I think it's more of a lyric poem. We have maybe a character of the Tyger, but the Tyger's not really doing anything. This is more of a meditation on the Tyger, or the idea of the Tyger, how the Tyger was made, who made the Tyger. So I don't think that there's a lot of, you can't really identify a plot or any sort of story that's happening in the poem. So if I had to categorize this, I would say it is a lyric poem. We can skip down the page and we can talk about the tone and voice of the poem. And I would say it's a poem of praise, right? The poet is kind of in awe of the Tyger and in awe of the creature, whether you want to attribute that to God, who made the Tyger. What immortal hand or eye? I would probably characterize this as a lyric poem, a poem of praise. The tone is one of respect and sort of awe toward the animal. One thing we'll talk a lot about in the future is imagery. I tend to love imagery. I love poems that have imagery. I think a lot of people do, because it's something, we live in a television culture, right? So the image in the poem is about as close as you can get to having something appearing on screen. And do we have a lot of images in this poem, The Tyger? And as I read it, I tend to think that we really don't. We have these sort of, maybe you'd call them a deep image, but which are, a little bit, deeper, more ethereal. But I don't think we have a lot of really physical descriptions here that we can identify with, right? What immortal hand or eye? These are sort of ethereal things, right? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? We don't have a whole lot of concrete language here, right? It's a little bit abstract. So I don't think that we have a lot of imagery. But what the poem lacks in imagery, it makes up for in form and in sound. Obviously, hopefully you picked up on the rhyme scheme, right? So if I read the second stanza, in what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? So we have eyes, aspire, fire. Skies, eyes, aspire, fire. So there's obviously a rhyme scheme here, which is helping propel the poem forward. And when we talk about poems, we're going to be talking a lot about their form. And a lot of that form comes from repetition. That's basically what a rhyme is. It's the repetition of a certain sound. So we have the repetition of the eyes sound and the ire sound in that second stanza. There's also repetition if we look at the first stanza and the last stanza, they're exactly the same. So it's sort of a refrain. If you've read ahead and you've gotten into the on sound unit for this week, you'll see Edgar Allan Poe write about the idea of repetition, what a refrain is, and how he has a refrain in The Raven. So we sort of have a refrain here. It begins with it's the first stanza of the poem, and it's also the last stanza of the poem. So that's a repetition. Rhyme is a type of repetition. Even the types of feet or meter that you use in a poem, the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, those patterns tend to repeat. So when we talk about poetry, we're going to talk a lot about patterns and repetition. And so those are some instances of repetition that I've seen in the poem. We can talk a little bit about sound specifically. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the fourth stanza. I'll read it. It's on page 1069. What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp, dare its deadly terrors clasp? So again, we have the sound, which is obvious at the end of this, at the end of the lines, right? Chain, brain, grasp, and clasp. So these are rhymes. They're pretty straightforward, but there's also some other repetitions of sound within that stanza. So, what the anvil, what dread grasp, dare its deadly terrors grasp. So we have dread and dead. And so those are sort of like a half rhyme, and they're not at the end of the stanza or at the end of the line. They're in the middle of the line, so we can call that an internal rhyme, and it's not exact, but it's similar, so you might call that an internal half rhyme, dread and deadly. We're repeating the sound, ed, dread, and dead. We have the extra syllable on deadly, but that sound repeats, and there's also a repetition if we read the first two and the final line. What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? Then we skip a line, dare its deadly terrors clasp. Excuse me, having trouble here this morning. So we have chain and brain, but we also have dare, and it's these hard A sounds. So chain, brain, and dare, they're not exact rhymes, they're not perfect rhymes, but there is that repetition of that sound. So when we talk about sound in a poem, we might be talking about rhyme or exact rhymes. But we can also talk about variations. So inside that stanza we have dread and deadly, which are similar sounds, and we have dare, which you can compare, which sort of echoes chain and brain. And I've skipped forward a little bit in this poem, but I really want to talk about the first stanza too, because this poem has a definite rhyme scheme, right? But in the third and fourth lines of the poem, in the first stanza, the rhyme scheme sort of hiccups. Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And maybe you're tempted to read it symmetry so that you can make the rhyme scheme consistent throughout the poem, but I read it as symmetry. I'm not sure if they would pronounce it any differently in the 1700s or 1800s. So I think it's funny that we have the rhyme scheme breaking in the first stanza, which is the stanza that's repeated, and I think everything else continues fairly straightforwardly throughout the rest of the poem. And I also find it interesting, one of the things on the worksheet is to talk about elements of word choice and diction, and this idea of symmetry, the use of the word symmetry, because it's things being equal, right? Or being mirrors of each other. That's kind of what a rhyme is. Chain and brain, grasp and clasp. They're sort of mirrors. They're not perfectly symmetrical, but a lot of that sound is symmetrical. So I think it's funny that in the first stanza, where we have the break in the rhyme scheme is on the word symmetry. So the word symmetry is actually asymmetrical with the sound, right? It is not symmetrical with I. So it's funny that this idea of symmetry is not being expressed in the word symmetry. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? So there's, we would call that a half rhyme. It's trying to rhyme, but it's not really being executed quite the way that we would expect. So I just find that might be something that I would write about in a worksheet or in a paper, is how Blake is using sound, and I think that the word choice of symmetry is purposeful there, because, and it's ironic because symmetry, that word symmetry, is not being symmetrical with the rhyme that we would expect. So if we're looking about other parts of the worksheet, categorize the poem as a lyric, maybe a poem of praise. It's got a definite rhyme scheme. Talked about a little bit of the word choice and diction. Talked about the tone, which is of praise. I wouldn't really say we have a character, so we have like an object that we're looking at and praising, but I don't think, there's no interaction, there's not really a lot of tension. Maybe there's tension between the creator and the Tyger, or the creator and the speaker in the poem, but I don't really know about that. Themes and symbols. The Tyger is maybe a symbol for all of existence, right? What Tyger created you, or what creature created the Tyger? Is it also the same creature that created the lamb and maybe created everything else? We've talked about sound, the length, stanzas, other sorts of forms, the refrain, the first stanza being repeated at the end of the last stanza. Not a whole lot of imagery. So those are things that you might be able to incorporate into your worksheets. So I know this is maybe not the most exciting poem for you. The next video is going to be on Robert Frost's Out Out, which I think is a little bit different. It's not lyric. It takes a different approach. It doesn't have quite the same rhyme scheme or any rhyme scheme. So that'll be the next video. So we can think about how we can compare and contrast these two poems.